Wow. Tony MacAskill? This guy's put his own wife in a when he's citing experts? Is he serious? You put your own wife there, Chris? Really? Hey everyone, so today I wanted to take a look at this plant chompers video that dropped a few days ago, maybe last week. It's called Two Competing Diabetes Reversal Diets, One Winner. So let's see what Mr. Chris MacAskill has to say.
Two competing approaches to reversing diabetes. The first is the quintessential American approach, which is to cash in on the boom in diabetes. For example, Virta Health was created by a very rich founder who raised hundreds of billions.
Okay, so there are lots of problems with the US healthcare system, and for profit health is, in a word, the problem, yeah? Or it's a big underlying cause of the problem, no question about it. But this particular example is a terrible example to give of that because, see, in order to get the way that for-profit health works is that most of the profit is actually coming from drugs, right? So if you get some money from the drug companies, from the pharmaceutical industry, you can do studies, you can do even very expensive studies sometimes. And the NIH also wants to leverage its own small pool of funds against the private sector. So effectively, if you're not selling drugs or you don't have a drug to sell, it's very hard to do research. And this team, I mean, the Virta Health people, Folik and Vinny, I mean, they're the keto people going back 40 years, I want to say. At least, at least I think Steve Finney does, right? So they were looking for a billionaire, a nice billionaire who was sympathetic to fund the research for a long time. And this is the solution that they found. So is it an ideal solution? No, of course not. In an ideal world, this kind of research would be publicly funded. But is it a practical solution given their needs and limitations? I think so.
Millions of dollars from venture capitalists to develop recipes, coaching, and software to help their customers track their progress. Virta's CEO had made his fortune by starting the real estate website Trulia.
Yes. So again, not relevant. Like how someone made their money. They needed a rich funder in order to do this work. I mean, one can argue that was the only way they could get it funded. So yeah, not a good argument.
Program costs $300 a month, and their goal is to recruit 100 million customers. You'll have to forgive me about being skeptical about this approach. First, I made an episode on why
skepticism is good, but this guy's also an idiot. I also think he's so condescending that it just gets very, very annoying listening to this guy. He's not telling you what he believes, right? He's telling you a certain script to fit a certain narrative, which is problematic.
Americans live 7 years less than other wealthy countries while spending twice as much per person on healthcare. The biggest factor turns out to be for-profit healthcare.
That is true, but you need to look at the big conglomerates, your Blue Cross Blue Shield, your Kaiser Permanente, even like it's those, it's the HMO model and the insurance and pharma sort of tie-up. That's the problem. Virta is it's not even big enough to be not even big enough to show up in that number even minutely, right? It's a tiny little blip, not relevant.
Second, Virta.
And by the way, I think one of their studies, I'll have to look it up, but I think they found that this is actually saving money, right? So the amount of money that an individual is paying to be part of this or whatever is saving the entire system a lot of money in diabetes drugs, right?
Recipes are high in processed meat, good for enticing 100 million people to join.
So I think this is nonsense. Like if you go to their website, I'm sure maybe these images are from the website, but there's plenty of pictures that don't include processed meat, and there's plenty of recipes that don't include processed meat. And I think they have like a whole vegetarian section on their website. So yeah, the vegans love to cherry pick. That's their whole. We should call them vegan cherry pickers. If they like to eat cherries too, so hey, let's call them a vegan cherry picker.
In the program, but universally condemned by actual nutrition scientists. Third, Virta's own
actual nutrition scientists. Is that a contradiction in terms? I suspect so, because most of what he's talking about is not nutrition science in the way that we can study metabolism and cellular biology. It is epidemiology.
Data paints a discouraging picture of results beyond the first year, despite placing all participants on metformin. And fourth, TEDx asked me to organize a longevity conference, and I couldn't find any longevity scientists who are aware of populations who live long lives.
Wow. Tony MacAskill? This guy's put his own wife when he's citing experts? Is he serious? You put your own wife there, Chris? Really?
Assuming low amounts of fruit, vegetables, and beans, as Virta recommends we do.
Yeah, it says right there, researcher plant chompers. Complete nonsense. And this is, so again, he's a vegan propagandist. He's a vegan ideologue. He's putting together a conference, and then he's saying, when I put together my conference, I didn't invite any of the experts who aren't vegan. That's basically what he's saying. What does it mean?
Is it possible there is a simpler, cheaper, more effective program to reverse diabetes?
It's possible, but it's also possible that you're full of it.
Find out, we filmed a program in California's farm country run by doctors, nutrition scientists, medical techs, and cooks, whose mission is not to get rich, but to help. Dr. Martha Sandoval is the medical director, a Stanford and UCSF-educated family medicine physician.
So just a word on California farm country. So, these folks would be, first of all, it's where the vast majority of U.S. fruits and vegetables come from, is in California. Secondly, these are people who are exposed to all kinds of environmental toxins if you're spraying stuff on plants and so on. So very at-risk population for a number of things. Thirdly, I think this is a population that is high in people from Mexico, especially, but also people from other South American countries. And we know that the consumption of sugary beverages, especially in Mexico and Mexican American populations, is very high. So if you want to reduce diabetes in that population, it's actually pretty easy. A little bit of education, telling them to even drink the diet sodas instead of the sodas, or ideally drink water, would probably, reduce A1C a couple of points, or, half a point over the course of a few months.
At Sutter Health, she volunteers her weekends for this program. It's a free 3-weekend program that provides blood tests, education, and has participants returning to the whole unprocessed food that their cultures once thrived on, with very low diabetes rates.
Sorry, I just want to go education. So this, so it's interesting here because that's a cell. I think that's mitochondria inside the cell. I'm not sure what they're showing, but they're showing glucose as the energy substrate. And they're showing, the panel there says insulin resistance at the top. It's got an insulin receptor. So I assume they're talking about, this is muscle and fat cells, right? So we're talking about the GLUT4 transport, which is insulin mitigated glucose transport into the cell. Now, the funny thing is, of course, there are many other substrates, or at least one, a very important substrate, fat, which the body can use, and that's not on the graph. So just to note that the way they're choosing to present cellular biology, okay, it's complicated and they're simplifying it, but they're simplifying it in a way that doesn't talk about the role of fat in energy production.
And has participants returning to the whole unprocessed food that their cultures once thrived on, with very low diabetes rates. The volunteers show them how to prepare delicious food.
Diabetes rates in Mexico are pretty high and climbing.
Simply. But are the results better than Virta's?
We found a nonprofit that is saving people from diabetes and many other chronic diseases. It's called Salud in tu Plato, which means health on your plate in Spanish.
A mí me motiva porque mi madre es diabética, tiene muchos años, mi padre también murió de diabetes, entonces yo sí dije no, como que no.
They've accomplished incredible results without any medications and in just...
So is there some kind of an induction on Chris's website that you have to be trained to speak, to talk down to people when you go on it? Is that how it works? Like, this is not... when you speak to someone, even when you speak to camera, speak to that person as an equal, not as, someone in grade 2, okay?
2 weeks. People go from pre-diabetic all the way to healthy biometrics, and they get off medications they've been on for decades. In the program's first year, 95% of patients showed a reduction in at least one biomarker for chronic disease. For instance, one patient's...
one biomarker. I mean, that's pretty easy, isn't it? I mean, yeah, I need to hear more, but it doesn't sound impressive at this point.
Triglycerides dropped from 409 down to 253.
Okay, so 253 triglycerides is still really, really bad. And triglycerides is an interesting marker to pay attention to because it tells you, it's a good marker of how much carbohydrate a person is having in the diet, right? The carbohydrates, sugar is super toxic, so sugar has to be taken out. And if the glycogen stores, which is where we store sugar, in the liver and the muscles, if those are full, as they often are in people who suffer from obesity, that has to be transferred into fat. And fat is less toxic. It stays in the blood in the form of triglycerides, which is why even in fasting triglycerides, we can see if they're elevated, it means someone probably has high insulin levels, probably has high glucose levels, probably is on their way to diabetes and all the other things as well.
Again, in just 2 weeks. A normal triglyceride level is under 150, and anything above 200 is considered high. And in one of their latest sessions, of patients who had high LDL cholesterol, 64% of them...
So LDL is not a marker of concern. It's not involved in the pathogenesis of heart disease, or if it is, it plays a fairly small role. We can look at actually the composition of plaques, atherosclerotic plaques. So when we have heart disease, what happens? We get these buildups of plaques, which solidify over time, and they become calcified as well. But what are those plaques made of? When we do an autopsy on a person, we find that they're made of mostly scar tissue, right? Mostly clotting factors, right? Cholesterol is a very, very small percentage. I think it might even be less than 2%. It's definitely less than 5%, right?
Brought it down to a normal level. Of patients who had high fasting glucose at baseline, 21% of them dropped it down to normal levels. We went to Watsonville, California to find out more.
21% is not particularly impressive, just to state. I mean, yeah. I'm not that I've done studies on my own client population, but I mean, we see 100% reduction, right? So we don't see anyone who doesn't do it pretty much if they stick to the plan.
And we brought along our friend Miguel Ramos, who helped interview and translate. Thanks, Miguel. You flew all the way here from Utah to join us to film this.
I did.
What's your motivation?
I believe that when you help different communities, you see an impact there and it spreads throughout other communities.
Here's Dr. Maria Jose Hummel, the program director, giving one patient her results after going through the program.
Oh my goodness. Oh, no, tu colesterol bajó de 220 a
So cholesterol, again, is not a marker of concern. We won't care about that. When you have people, replace the butter and the animal fats with these seed oils, especially, or even things like avocado oil, or even things like olive oil, you're giving them phytosterols, which sort of mimic cholesterol in the blood and sort of will lower cholesterol levels significantly. Whether that's a good thing, I personally don't think it's a good thing. There's no reason to believe it would be a good thing, right? It certainly doesn't lead to less heart disease.
LDL de 141 a 90. Alto a normal, alto a normal. Tus triglicéridos subieron, pero está normal, porque esto debe estar así.
Right. HDL has stayed the same. Triglycerides have gone up. Am I reading that correctly? That's not a good thing. Blood pressure has gone up. Well, blood pressure I think is more or less the same. These results are not good. If this was my client, I would not be happy with her. I certainly wouldn't be praising her.
50, o sea, es una variación normal dentro de lo normal. Igual tu glucosa más bien bajó 3 puntos, sigue siendo normal.
So that change in glucose is, it's a rounding error. It's basically nothing. We want fasting glucose somewhere around 80, maybe below that if possible. This is not, again, these are not, especially that triglyceride number would concern me. It means that we would want to measure fasting insulin as well. We would want to see what's going on with your fasting insulin. But if the triglycerides are going up and the fasting insulin is going up, it means the intervention is actually having the opposite results. I don't care about cholesterol and all the rest of it, right?
Está bajo de 100. De 100 para arriba es prediabetes. Estabas más cerca de la prediabetes.
So pretending that that's a significant shift of 3 points, it's not. I mean, it's just, if you did no intervention and you took her blood on 3 different days, you would get numbers that are kind of similar, right? One might have been 94, one might have been 97, one might have been 91. This is not a relevant difference.
Más lejos de la prediabetes. Lo más importante es que este número de colesterol es muy alto. O sea, con este número te van a dar medicina.
So who makes the decision that a cholesterol level is high? Because really there are 2 options. You can listen to the quote unquote experts, right? Or you can listen to your own body, which have millions of years of evolution and genes behind it, right? So it's up to you who you want to choose, but this person is not making any sense, right?
Igual, este es preocupante, porque con este número estás en peligro de un ataque al corazón.
That is, I suppose it's true, but it's not, you can't scare people. Most people show up in the hospital having a heart attack with low cholesterol. Most people who have a heart attack have had low to normal cholesterol for years and years and years, right? We have data proving this. So saying that you need to lower your cholesterol to reduce your risk of heart attack is kind of, it's nonsense, right?
O sea, este número es demasiado alto. Este es el colesterol que tapa las arterias. Si está más de 100, es peligro.
No, it's not. Cholesterol doesn't block arteries. It's clotting factors. You can do an autopsy of people who've died of heart disease. You see what the clots are made of. It's made of these clotting factors, these proteins, the scar tissue, if you want to think about it in that way.
Y te bajó a 90. Es un cambio. Ninguna medicina más. Ninguna. Y esto en 2 semanas. Inaudito.
So, there are medicines that do that, like your PCSK9 inhibitors and so on, and your benpezoic acid or benpezoic acid. So there are medicines that do this, and you're not giving the right information, lady.
Funcionando, nadie te puede obligar, pero si tú mantienes la alimentación y mantienes esos números, vas a estar fuera del peligro de una enfermedad.
This is not true. This is just not true. Again, most people who have a heart attack had low to normal cholesterol, right? That's not disputed by any sensible person, I don't think. What some of those papers will say is, then we need to lower cholesterol more, which is a weird takeaway.
Ahora, ¿sería bueno para ti bajar un poquito más la glucosa? pero no tienes prediabetes. La bajaste ya unos poquitos números, te alejaste más de la
Yeah. So the intervention that you've done has done nothing to her glucose, is what you're saying.
prediabetes, ¿verdad? Pero si te alejaras un poco más, estarías más segura, ¿verdad?
And what have been some of the
Yeah. So the blood sugars, I mean, one of the main things we'd look at, I would look at fasting insulin as well to find out what's going on with that. And the blood sugar shows basically no improvement. The other markers, triglycerides have gone in the wrong direction. HDL has stayed stable. So based on that, and again, I'm thinking here that they must be showing some of their best cases, right? I mean, if I were making this video, I would want to show people who've done well, right? So if that's one of your better cases, that's really not a good sign.
results you've seen? If you can give numbers to it.
We've seen amazing results with this program. The one biometric that we've seen that
She's going to say cholesterol or LDL.
responds the fastest with a diet change is the total cholesterol as well as the LDL
Told you.
cholesterol, otherwise known as the bad cholesterol, which is also the riskiest, if you will, or the one number that is the best predictor of heart disease risk.
That is complete nonsense, and she has to know it. If she doesn't know it, she should get her medical license taken away, right? So what are the biggest, even according to every literature, every piece of literature out there, what is the biggest risk factor for heart disease? High blood pressure, number one, yeah? Maybe high blood sugar. So those two can compete for number one. I'm not sure which is going to be, it depends on the study. One is number one is number two. Smoking status, number three, right? LDL, I mean, there's going to be other factors before LDL. When we look at, just to give you a number here, high LDL, even in the statin trials and so on that are used to make this case, high LDL increases one's likelihood. First of all, it's not risk. So there's the association between having high cholesterol and having heart attack or stroke or some kind of event is depending on the study between 5 and 30%, right? So, but if you take diabetes, now it's an increase of 1,000%, right? 10 times, right? So she has to know that what she said is false. And if she doesn't, she's criminally negligent.
And we do see total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol drop dramatically for some people in only 10 days to 14 days. So our program is 10 days technically, but since there's 2 weeks in between.
There are lots of things that can lower cholesterol, right? If I go to the gym, for example, if I overtrain, my cholesterol goes down. Is that a good thing? I don't think so.
We say, well, if you want to continue for the full time, the full 2 weeks, that's even better. And for the first year of our program, when we were first trying to figure out what to do, we calculated the average for all our participants was a 22% drop in LDL cholesterol. And that's when we're
So again, that's not necessarily a good thing. In fact, depending on how it drops, it's probably a bad thing.
still figuring out what we were doing. And so there's people who followed it 100%. There's people who didn't follow it at all. There's people who didn't see any changes. And we were still able to see a 22% drop in 2 weeks. And I see even better numbers than that. So again, that was just an average. So we see the numbers improve even 50% for some people or more. We also see people's fasting glucose improve for some people quite dramatically. It's a nutritional.
So is she going to give us a number for fasting glucose? Because what we saw was not impressive so far.
Intervention program, if you will, or nutritional immersion program. We have people come here to the clinic for biometrics. We use their facility to measure people's fasting glucose as well as their cholesterol or lipid panel. We also measure their weight and their height and blood pressure. Then we give them a menu and some recipes. And then we suggest that they eat a whole food plant-based diet for at least 10 days. Then we have them come back and do the same thing 2 weeks later. In between, we have a nutrition class, the weekend in between, and we teach them about the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet. And the last weekend, when we do this again, we compare the numbers before and after the nutritional intervention.
The program's medical director is Dr. Martha Sandoval. She has an impressive background leading plant-based initiatives in traditional healthcare, such as by teaching group classes.
So Dr. Sandoval, tell us about yourself. So I was born in Mexico. I grew up in Hollister. I went to Stanford undergrad and Stanford Medical. I did the UCSF Family Medicine residency in Salinas and the Trinidad Medical Center. I have been at the Palo Alto Medical Foundation for 24 years now. I became certified.
So they said rural California. This is Palo Alto. Palo Alto is the South Bay, San Francisco area, broadly speaking. So I would classify this as a suburban population, not a rural population.
Whole Foods Plant-Based in 2017. And so since 2017, I've been talking to my patients on one-on-one basis on Whole Foods Plant-Based. We're not even focusing on lifestyle changes as exercise and sleep and social connections. We're just focusing on diet. And that's really remarkable. And it seems like some of the other things just follow through or follow along with. Once you make dietary changes, then you feel better, then you're out more, or you're in a better mood, or you sleep better, and you socialize better.
So
that's definitely true. Like once you improve your diet, things are going to go better. And before she gets into it, let me just say that I have no doubt that one of the big issues in this population is added sugar. and therefore taking away the added sugar, which I assume they're doing as a bare minimum, unless they're completely negligent, is going to lead to improvements, right? So I would actually expect pretty significant improvements. Let's see, more significant than we saw with that previous case study.
Here's exactly what patients are advised to eat.
Esta hoja que explica cómo las recomendaciones de comer la mitad de la comida de plantas, frutas y verduras, una cuarta parte de los carbohidratos sin procesar y una cuarta parte del plato.
So again, this particular individual that she's explaining to seems to be young, but if this is advice given to older people, it's pretty negligent. Like we know that as we get older, our ability to synthesize, our need for amino acids, our need for proteins increases. And this does not look like it's going to meet people's protein needs, right? So I think we're talking borderline negligence here. Number one. Number two, I assume that's tofu and not cheese. Why are all of your, what benefit is there? What documented benefit is there to getting proteins with fiber? Yeah, and a lot of those are, I mean, they're not complete proteins, right? And the entire plate says, well, the fruits and vegetables doesn't say with fiber, but they do have fiber. So you're eating, fiber is just indigestible polysaccharides. That's the definition of fiber. So it's indigestible sugar. So your entire plate is either sugar or indigestible sugar. I mean, this sounds like a complete disaster for gut health.
Proteínas preferible con fibra, como los frijoles, lentejas y legumbres. Y luego al lado reverso está toda la comida que uno puede comer a cantidad que guste. Cuidado con la lista amarilla y ojalá evitar lo que pueda de la lista roja.
Okay, so the green list, the yellow list, and the red list. So why are we having whole grain rice? So notice whole grain rice is on the green list, but white rice is on the red list. Okay, it's just the same stuff. It breaks down to exactly the same thing in the gut, right? If it breaks down at all, or it isn't digested, right? Yeah, whole grain pastas. This must be vegetable pastas, and it must be those like lentil pastas and stuff that you get. Corn tortillas is in the green list. So advising people who are at risk of developing diabetes to eat carbohydrates. That's pretty much all I see. Yeah, not including oats. This is really bad advice. Really bad advice.
La leche, pues ya cambiamos la leche. Ya no tomamos leche de
Oh goodness. Oh goodness. He's going to say oat milk or something, isn't he?
vaca pura de almendra, soya, y avena.
So oat milk, almond milk, or soy milk. First of all, what MacAskill said in the beginning is that these are traditional, people being put on their traditional diets. That's not traditional. That's processed junk, number one. Number two, when you look at the ingredients of some of these things, they have added sugars, they have added seed oils, it's really nasty processed food. So you can't call it healthy by any stretch of the imagination. Now, milk does have too much sugar. So I'm not saying that milk would be appropriate for people who are at risk of diabetes, but come on, man, this is ridiculous.
So coming from a Mexican family myself, we didn't get taught about what's good for you, what food is going to prevent you from getting diabetes, but they teach that. And I can tell that people are excited about it and they really like the food. One thing that stood out to me while we were there is...
So no one has explained in this entire video, we're at 10 minutes and 30 seconds. No one has explained even the definition of diabetes, right? No one has explained that, right? And no one has explained that all these carbohydrates break down into sugar in the blood, into glucose in the blood. No one has done that, which is the basic. This is 101 stuff, right? Someone comes for a lecture on diabetes. This is what you get the first few minutes, right? And the only reason they're doing that, I can imagine, is because they want to somehow convince you that a diet made mostly of sugar and carbohydrates is a way to reverse a disease that is characterized by an excess of sugar and carbohydrates in the body.
I think he was either a security worker or maybe a janitor, but he wasn't part of the program. And he tried some of the food and he was asking for the recipes. And I just thought, here he is, like asking for tofu recipes, at least in my
So the hedonistic stuff, like I don't get. Like we're not talking about what tastes good here. I could give a damn. When I was vegan, and I was vegan for a long time, I used to make really tasty food, right? I don't really care. I lost my health, right? And I became addicted to some of those foods as well, right? Some of those carbohydrate-rich, sugary foods. So the hedonistic stuff, like, yeah, sure, you can make tasty food that's vegan. So what?
Family, nobody eats tofu. And so, but once he tried it, he liked it and realized how good it is.
Yeah, and this food they're serving, it's actually pretty traditional, right?
Oh yeah, like if you look at a lot of those things, first off, some of them, the recipes haven't changed at all. Like,
yeah, oat milk, almond milk is not traditional. Okay, let's be clear.
The pico de gallo that they made, that's just normal pico de gallo, no change there. And then they talked about making these other recipes that are very traditional, but just changing them a little bit. For example, tamales are
Tamales de tofu. That sounds pretty awful. Tofu tamales.
Our big celebration food, we eat them at Christmas, and it's typically made with a lot of lard and then stuffed with, meat and typically pork. And what they do is they say, instead of adding all the lard, we're going to put in some cashew cream and maybe a little bit of sweet potato in the mustard.
So the cashew cream is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because first of all, is it traditional? Well, cashews are coming from South America, so I suppose they might have had access to cashew fruits and cashew nuts in Mexico. The only place I've seen cashew fruit eaten, to be honest, is Brazil. So I don't think it's part of Mexican food traditionally. But the problem is, okay, so why would vegan diets work for reducing diabetes incidence and so on? It's because you're eliminating one substrate, right? There are multiple substrates, as I've mentioned, sugar and fat being the two main ones. So glucose and fatty acid cycles, right? So that's the two ways in which the mitochondria get substrate in order to produce ATP, in order to convert ADP, adenosine diphosphate, into ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is how we get our energy, right? So in order to limit the toxicity of that, so the problem is we have basically too much substrate going in our mouths, right? And that could be too many carbohydrates or it could be too many fats. But when you have a combination of those, the effect is multiplied. Let's put it that way. The mitochondria get confused, if you want to think about it that way. We've made videos on the Randall cycle before. Let's just say that because sugar is more toxic, it has to get processed more quickly. Let's put it that way, right? Sugar is very toxic in the blood. So by having the cashew cream and other high-fat foods in there, you're basically eliminating any benefit you might be getting. So in fact, this is worse. When I first saw that MacAskill had made this video, I thought, okay, well, again, he's going to show what we know, which is that vegan diets can reduce diabetes if they're a low-fat diet. But it seems like the diet they're doing isn't particularly low-fat. So are they going to get results? Let's see.
In the dough.
Let's see just how yummy those plant-based tamales are and whether they're as good as the original version.
Wonderful.
Like, how does it taste compared to like traditional tamales to you?
So again, the hedonistic factor, like I could give a damn about.
They don't have that heaviness, but beyond that, like I would say that. If
not having the heaviness could actually be a downside because yes, when you mix the fats and carbs, it's not a good idea in general, but it will at least limit the quantity you can have. If you have just carbs without the fats or even with some vegetable fats, not proper animal fats, you can overconsume those. You can eat a whole lot of them. And in the end, that's not actually a good thing, right? It doesn't trigger the satiety mechanisms that we're born with. And I know this is someone who overate vegan food for years and years and years.
Give that to me and be like, oh, this is how we make tamales in my city. I'd be like, oh yeah, that's a tamal.
What do you mean by heaviness? Is that like greasy?
Yeah, because usually you mix in pork lard into the dough. And so they're usually pretty heavy. Like you eat at the tamal joint and you're like, ooh, I hit like a brick.
That's some diabetes.
Yeah. Well, it's great when they're not as heavy because they can eat more. So
that's exactly what I just said. You're going to eat more, and it's not a great thing.
Because they're
you guys seem to be really good at doing.
Yeah,
eating more and more.
That's my job.
Yeah, so again, in a video that's about weight loss and diabetes management, is it good to have the two young healthy people overeating on camera? Is that a good message you want to send, MacAskill?
Del programa por mi doctor. El doctor me recomendó a la doctora que viniera porque estaba llegando un prediabetes. Entonces me recomendó.
Ah, sí. ¿Y qué tal le fue?
Maravillosamente bien. O sea, darme cuenta que como estaba comiendo no era saludable ni bueno para mi salud, me hizo reflexionar sobre los hábitos que tenía. Me fue muy bien.
¿Y cuáles son los cambios que usted hizo?
Empecé a dejar la comida procesada, McDonald's.
Yeah, so if you go from eating junk food to eating anything, if you're bringing your own meals from home or whatever it may be, like you're going to see massive improvements, aren't you?
Taco Bell, los burritos, empecé a meter jugos verdes.
Despite the green smoothies, the green smoothies aren't helping anyone, I can promise you. And I should just say, some of the most serious cases I've seen in my years as a health coach are people who came to me thinking that they were having a good, healthy diet, and they had serious oxalate toxicity from just having like raw smoothies and kale smoothies, spinach smoothies, and so on. So if there's one piece of advice I'd like you to take away from this, I'd like him to take away maybe is, just get rid of that green smoothie. If you need a smoothie recipe, I think there's some on this channel.
Vegetales. Entonces dejé las carnes, a comer un poco más de pescado. Entonces me fue bien, a pesar de que fue muy corto, bajé 2 libras.
So that's interesting. So they're advising him to stop eating meat, but he is eating more fish, even though these folks are vegan ideologues. So I think it's hard even for vegan ideologues to claim that fish is unhealthy because of all the epidemiological data in favor of it. So anyway, 2 pounds. 2 pounds. I mean, we see more weight loss than that in the first week, right? I mean, in a week of low carb, if someone presents with that kind of overweight, at least 5 pounds, and that's mostly water weight. So this guy, like, he hasn't even lost the water weight. Like, he hasn't even begun the transformation from my perspective. Sugar coming down is good.
O el azúcar, entonces me fue bien.
Sí.
Estoy motivado para volver otra vez. Y pues ojalá la gente que no conozca se dé la oportunidad. Yo me la di y todo es por mi salud. Y yo agradezco a quien esté apoyando este programa, porque vale la pena para uno que, más que nada, hispano que no sabe comer. Va las carnitas, va la carne, va todo eso.
So again, the problem is blood sugars, as you just said, and you've just indicated foods that don't contain any sugar, pork and beef, etc. How do you figure that one out?
Entonces, a mí me motiva porque mi madre es diabética, tiene muchos años, mi padre también murió de diabetes, entonces yo sí dije no, como que no.
Sí. ¿Y fue difícil?
Fue difícil no preparar ni comer. Lo difícil es mentalizar, todo está en la mente. Es decir, lo tienes que hacer por tu bien.
This is very true. I think once you make the mindset shift, once you sort of say, I'm committing to go through this process of transformation for myself, for my own good, for my family, for whatever your why is, I think then you're likely to do it. Unfortunately, this guy's getting bad advice, and he's going through a great transformation process, it sounds like. Full kudos to him. He's just getting bad medical advice, unfortunately.
Sí, porque difícil sería si fuera algo complicado para mí. Si para mí no es difícil comer carnitas, ¿por qué no comerlo saludable? Eso fue lo difícil. Como que el sabor no me gustaba los 2-3 días, pero dije, no, solo por hoy. Hoy comemos, mañana no.
Sí.
Hoy. Y de esa manera me convencí un poquito de que tengo que cambiar y voy motivado a...
So again, this is great. Talking about the transformation process, super helpful. Full respect to anyone's transformation process. I mean, I may disagree with this video as a whole, but full respect to this gentleman. He's doing a great job.
A volver si está de nuevo el programa.
Sí. ¿Y ahora le está gustando esa comida más?
Me está, sí, porque son diferentes sabores, diferentes texturas, algo que yo no tenía el conocimiento y mira, hasta bajé, que es lo que uno quiere, bajar de peso. Sí, me gusta.
Yeah, so again, tofu is not a traditional food in his society, right? Cashew milk or whatever is not cashew cream is not a traditional food, right? So talking about this as if it was a decolonization project is just dishonest.
¿Y en qué trabaja usted?
Soy troquero. Estoy sentado de 10 a 12 horas sentado, manejando. Pero pues llevo mi jugo verde, mi ensaladita. Entonces, debes de...
Yeah, so he was a trucker. He was going around to eating at truck stops and McDonald's and so on, and probably drinking 40 ounces of like Coca-Cola or something with that, right? So any kind of improvements. In fact, I'm shocked that his improvements aren't better because you would expect a lot more weight loss. You would expect you'd expect him to look in a little bit better condition. Just getting rid of the junk food and replacing it with nothing, just fasting. You would expect him to look better than he's currently presenting.
Comer un burrito o algo, pues llevo mis nueces, mis almendras y tomo agua bastante. Qué cosa que no tomaba.
Sí, ¿qué tomaba? Coca-Cola.
Soda, jugos.
I mean, exactly. So again, if you take out the sugary beverages from a person who was living this kind of lifestyle, I would expect more than 2 pounds of weight loss. So maybe there's other things he's doing which is actually counterproductive, making his situation worse.
Sí, no, ahora agua, le echo limón y nada de azúcar y así me lo estoy tomando. Y pues como que ya el paladar, tengo que acostumbrarme. O sea, así como me acostumbré a lo malo, pues también tengo que acostumbrarme a lo bueno.
Sí, y es lo bueno, ¿no? Que nos podemos acostumbrar.
You're getting used to eating the new stuff, whether it's good. Time will tell, I guess.
Acostumbrarnos a lo que comamos a menudo, ¿no?
Claro, o sea, todo está en querer. Sí, porque uno podrá decir, sí, pero no, en que uno quiera hacerlo. Todo está en la mente. Para mí todo está ahí.
Adults of Mexican origin in the United States have rates of diabetes much higher than that of Mexicans living in Mexico. As you'll discover,
I'm going to look at that. I think diabetes rates in Mexico are certainly high and climbing, as far as I know. And again, sugar-sweetened beverages are a big part of that story.
from our interviews of patients, one reason for this might be their increased adoption of the standard American diet when they move to the US.
And some people also notice, for example, in Mexican populations,
You think it's the standard American diet? I mean, do you think that's the problem? Jesus.
type 2 diabetes is especially prevalent. How much of this do you think is genetics versus lifestyle?
I personally think it's lifestyle.
100%?
So it can't be genetics, right? Genetics would take years, maybe certainly decades, certainly centuries, maybe even centuries to manifest themselves, right? Unless you have a bottleneck. It's a different story how genetics change, right? But in the case where you don't have a huge die-off of a population, genetics take a long time to manifest themselves. So whatever's happening has happened since roughly 1978, when the US dietary guidelines, low-fat guidelines were approved. Go figure why that was a problem. So nothing has changed in your genetics or in anyone's genetics since 1978. I can promise you that much.
I don't do medical research, and I can't say that I've read those articles, but I am convinced it's lifestyle. I mean, I grew up my mom had diabetes. I grew up drinking soda 3 times a day.
Okay, so again, you just take that out, and you would see massive improvements, right? Not doing nothing else.
I never had a salad before I went to university, and I can say I don't have diabetes. I've really changed the way I eat. I can remember in medical school eating a Snickers bar and Coca-Cola for lunch. That was
My goodness, man. So again, like when you have this kind of a change, is it the and I say this as someone who maybe I was eating a standard diet in my teens, but I went vegan in university and pretty healthy vegan. I was like at the health food store and so on. And I had serious problems, right, as a vegan. So my question to her would be the benefits that you see. Is it because of the food that you're eating, which sounds pretty toxic and not good for the gut to me? Or is it because you no longer have a Snickers and a Coke for lunch, right?
my lunch, but I take care of myself. So I do have it in my genes, but I take care of myself and I take care of my family the same way. So I think a lot of it has to do with habits and knowledge, really, because I don't think anybody would continue to eat poorly if they knew that was leading them to an unhealthy state.
In filming this, we've become very interested in how tradition shapes health. And our hypothesis is that traditional Mexican culture is comprised of very healthy foods, but nowadays people are eating a lot of the more standard American diet fare. And in your own patients, do you see this kind of generational shift where the older people tend to eat like healthier diets, whereas the younger people have perhaps less salubrious habits?
Yeah.
Traditional diets in Mexico, from what I know, so they make a bit of a fuss about things like tomatoes and squashes and beans and corn. And these are important foods. I don't mean that they're not important, especially for the Aztecs who had to find ways to feed a large urbanized population that was largely comprised of serfs and slaves, right? So people who had been enslaved, right? So there's a lot of politics going into this, but it also included turkey, right? Turkey was a big thing. That was the local fowl. Turkey eggs as well. I think there's some accounts of eating things like dog meat, lizards, insects, and grubs. So yes, indigenous diets are worth reviving, but let's not be selective about them, right? Let's not pick just the foods that we like. Where's the turkey in this diet? Where are the turkey eggs? Where is the bugs, the grubs? That would be interesting to see.
However, some of our older patients, say the 80, 70, 80-year-old who live with their 40, 50-year-old children, are dependent on what the children are cooking and bringing to the home. And so that makes it a challenge for those patients. You know, depending to how long patients have lived here, people have lived here, then they too have developed taste for things like hamburgers and pizza and things that are not as healthy, and have not stuck with a lot of the traditional cooking, or they get used to drinking soda and drinking juice. So a lot of it is culture, but a lot of it is what's available.
I would just say I had a career where I traveled to, I think, more than 70 or 80 countries in my life. And one of the cities that really surprised me was Mexico City, as a place where the cuisine was really sophisticated and tasty. And it did have roots to some of those ancient origins. And I met people who sort of explained it in more detail, but it's definitely interesting. Mexican cuisine is interesting, and it is under attack. Like our cuisines all over the world. I mean, we see this in India, we see this in South Africa, we see this everywhere, that the Americanization, the globalization of food culture is a thing, right? That's interesting.
Tiene por lo que lo rápido, ya no le pone el tiempo a la comida para nutrirnos. Mi madre nos daba frijoles, nos daba verduras, yo no comía carnitas, yo no comía pan, yo no comía McDonald's, yo no comía.
I find it hard to believe that those beans, for example, weren't cooked in lard. Meat must have been part of the staple food as well, right? Even no matter which culture, no matter which class this gentleman grew up in Mexico, it's not like it's a vegetarian culture. I spent enough time as a vegetarian and a vegan trying to get some food in Mexico and failing for the most part to know that it's not a vegetarian culture.
Todo eso nunca lo comí. En mi casa no. Mi padre era muy estricto. Pero yo me caso, tengo mis hijos, y aquí hay una hamburguesa, aquí unas papitas, van cambiando. Eso pues, cambió la manera de comer, no la manera de vivir. O sea, también aquí en Estados Unidos es bien difícil porque el tiempo de trabajar y todavía llegar se nos hace más fácil. Pasa por un pollo, pasa por unas hamburguesas, pasa. Ese es el gran problema. Más ajetreado. Y vemos niños con diabetes. Vemos muchos niños con diabetes. Yo tengo nietos.
So again, the children with diabetes, again, I can't generalize, but what I've seen, they get like, you put them in a car at 7 a.m. and you give them a Coke on their way to school and stuff. Like the extent to which sugary beverages are a part of this story they're mentioned it, but I think they need to mention it more in order to paint the correct picture here.
Ya soy abuelo con diabetes, no te creas.
Wow.
Sí, esa es la diferencia.
Sí, sí, eso tiene mucho sentido para mí porque en mi familia también hemos visto lo mismo. Sí.
Sí.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
No, no, al contrario, les agradezco mucho.
Have your chicken mole without chicken. Just make the mole and put it on top of vegetables.
Mole is just sauce. Sauce and vegetables. What is that? There's no protein in there.
Have your chicken pozole or pork pozole, but don't put in the pork or chicken. Put in garbanzos instead of the meat, and you can still add all the other yummy flavors.
So pozole, as far as I know, has some kind of corn in there, right? So you're having corn and garbanzos, so carb on top of carb for someone who's suffering from diabetes or potentially going to suffer from diabetes, which is a carbohydrate intolerance, right? Bizarre.
Same thing with chile verde, which is another very popular dish. Instead of the pork, you add garbanzos and vegetables and put that on top of rice with your same green sauce. And so I remind patients that all the flavor is in the sauce. It's not in the meat. And if you
Again, like flavor is not relevant here. Yeah.
learn how to find another protein to replace that animal protein, whether it's tofu or garbanzos.
Tofu is not part of your culture, of Mexican culture, of North American culture, right? Tofu is a dish that comes from China, where it is traditionally served with pork, right? Mapo tofu. If you go in China and you order it, you get a big bowl of pork and a little bit of tofu. Okay.
Or lentils, you can still keep the flavors from the sauces.
O sea, han mejorado.
So I opened by saying this is a story of two competing diabetes reversal programs.
But it's not. They're not the same stuff. Virta Health is year after year after year on a much bigger population and much closer tracking. This was 2 weeks, not even 3 weeks. So how is it a comparison, MacAskill?
How can we compare a 3-weekend program to Virta when Virta has 5 years of data on 122 of their patients?
That's what I just said.
I said the Virta data was very discouraging. For example, their diet is keto, but at 2 years, only 14% of their clients who were motivated enough to complete the study were in ketosis, even though they had all the coaching and software Virta could provide. And by
Yeah, so that doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? So measuring keto, there are different ways to measure ketosis, quote unquote ketosis. And some of those, if you're using home monitors, they're not particularly reliable. People get better at using ketones, so they show up less in the blood. That's not a criticism. That's just an observation.
at the second year, their numbers look grim, and we're trending up despite putting all their clients on metformin. But you don't need to take it from me.
So those numbers are only one piece of the puzzle, right? If you look at fasting insulin came down, blood pressure came down, people got off medications. You're talking about people with advanced type 2 diabetes who were approved for this trial. So, you know, it's not a normal. For example, the blood work of the person who was in the beginning, who had a blood sugar of in the 90s, right? That's not the kind of person we're talking about. We're talking about someone who's been injecting insulin, and they're even with the insulin, their fasting blood sugar maybe 140, 150, 170, right? So it's a different patient population. So comparing that group to this group is kind of silly.
Thing is, there are a lot of companies providing digital diabetes management who've been around for a long time with enormous funding. We've had enough time to figure out
the fact that something is funded doesn't mean anything, dude. It's not a criticism. It's a criticism of the U.S. healthcare system, which I can fully get behind. But this is, that's the water in which they're swimming. They have no choice, right? And none of the big evil things in U.S. private healthcare are on here, right? The big pharmaceutical companies and so on are not listed here.
If they work. Axios reported on a very large study of their effectiveness and called it scathing. It's this report, 50 pages, highly referenced, and I'll link it in the description.
Okay. How is it relevant? Because you're talking about one particular study with one particular patient population against this. So actually, this is a bit of a bait and switch, right? Because he doesn't know enough about Virta's study, I think, to analyze it meaningfully. He's just trying to tout this own study. Fine. If you want to tout your study, that's cool. But why do you want to knock someone else's hard work, which you don't even understand, it looks like?
Conclusion is digital diabetes care from all these companies is not effective and only drives up healthcare costs. To be fair, they said the nutritional ketosis program Virta uses has some promise. But let's drill down into Virta's 5-year results. In 5 years, the 122 people who didn't drop out of the program had an average reduction in fasting glucose from 158 to 151.
Again, that's just one number. We can look at other charts which show normalization in blood pressure, which is probably a huge thing, getting rid of some of these medications, right? So remember, this is a population that was advanced diabetic population, right? Their A1C is 7.5, and they're still injecting insulin, right? So you can't just take one number out of context and say, oh, look, their fasting glucose hasn't done very well, because again, it's a certain kind of population. They're looking for a certain set of results.
From diabetic to diabetic, despite seeing some decent weight loss. So why aren't those programs working? I think it's because glucose weight loss.
Just to go back to this number, the fasting insulin number is interesting and trending in the right way, right? Going down from near 26 to near 18, that's pretty good, right? The home IR is going well. Yeah, the medication effect score, which is probably looking for how much medications people are injecting and the side effects and so on, that seems to be going well. So you can't just cherry pick a couple of numbers and say, and again, it's a different kind of population than what we were looking at in this clinic, and say, it's not a great, it's not a successful program, because from what I've seen, it is a successful program.
So why aren't those programs working? I think it's because glucose monitors are not telling us what we think they are. Virta shows a graphic on their website claiming rises in
glucose monitor is only one of the tools that they're using, and I don't even know that they're using it in all the cases. Certainly at the beginning when they started that study, I don't think they were. I'll have to look again, but who cares? Glucose monitor is just one thing. As I mentioned, we have diabetes normalization, we have reduction in the number of medications, we have other metrics which are trending in the right direction.
Glucose after a meal aren't healthy, and you should seek to flatten them. That's why they recommend meat and cheese dishes, because they only provide a small rise in blood glucose after meals.
We recommend meat because it doesn't contain freaking carbohydrates, and diabetes is a disease that is characterized by an intolerance of carbohydrate, right? By a carbohydrate intolerance. So this is not rocket science, people.
The most profound advice I ever got from my professors was always look for the data point that doesn't fit the theory.
See, that's how I know Chris MacAskill is full of shit, because he never, ever does that. He's happy to look at data points that don't fit someone else's theory, which is what he's just going to show us. By the way, let's put this all on the screen.
I think the most interesting...
All of this is epidemiological nonsense. All of it. There's no science here at all. And how do we know that? And by the way, not only is it, so what's going on here? Two things. One is the healthy user bias. If you tell people meat is unhealthy, and then you ask them to make a food frequency questionnaire of tick all the boxes of all the foods that they eat, they're probably, first of all, they don't remember. Do you remember what you ate yesterday? I don't really. Well, I do, because I eat the same thing every day, but maybe I'm an exception. But most people don't remember what they ate yesterday, so they tick the boxes that they think represent who they are. If they see themselves as healthy, they're not going to tick the box that says red meat. If they see themselves as unhealthy, they are going to tick the box that says red meat. And by the way, people who see themselves as unhealthy are more likely to drink, more likely to smoke, less likely to take vitamins, blah, 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 right? Now, how do we know that's the case? Two reasons. One is when we look at the epidemiological data in populations that don't get this advice, for example, in Asia, we find there is no such correlation. If anything, meat eating correlates with more healthy people because meat is seen as a health food, rightfully so. Secondly, when we look at countrywide data, so not these attempts to extrapolate data from small populations, just look country by country and look at something like the amount of meat consumed per capita versus something like lifespan, longevity, right? We see that a place like Hong Kong has both the most meat consumed per capita and the highest longevity. Now, that does not prove that meat is causing that, but it's a pretty strong piece of evidence against the idea that meat is unhealthy, right? In other words, epidemiology cannot be used to prove a hypothesis, but it can be used at least to disprove. Like if there was a strong signal there, or if France is another example of a country that eats more meat per capita than almost all countries in Europe and has some of the best, certainly more saturated fat per capita than the rest of Europe, and has the best healthcare outcomes despite higher rates of smoking and other things, right? Which should be a confounder. They should lower the rates in France, the life expectancy in France, right? So again, this epidemiological data is not good for advancing a hypothesis, but it's good for disproving the opposite, right? When you see that correlation again and again and again and again, there's a paper that shows it, I think they studied 176 countries, the more meat you eat, the longer you live. When you see that data again and again and again, it disproves the opposite. It doesn't prove the hypothesis that meat eating is healthy, but it disproves the idea that meat eating is unhealthy. Make sense?
Data point comes from research centers all around the world who keep reporting data showing red meat is linked to diabetes. How can that be? It barely causes a glucose rise after a meal, unlike, say,
It can be because, as we've discussed, as we saw with that gentleman, the truck driving gentleman, when he went to get a hamburger, what else was he having? He was having Coke and he was having French fries, right? So when the behaviors associated with eating meat are also behaviors that are associated with developing type 2 diabetes, then you would see that correlation, right? It makes perfect sense.
Beans and rice. My low-carb friend Nick Norwitz says it's like swatting flies to try to refute a never-ending stream of those papers.
So Nick Norwitz, you should go and see his video. Maybe I'll link to it below. He makes exactly the point that I'm making, that this is epidemiological junk. It's not science.
But we may have a mechanism. A number of papers...
So I want to see that mechanism. How is eating meat and fat, protein and fat, animal protein and fat, how does that get broken down at the cellular level and cause mitochondrial dysfunction leading to diabetes? Show me that.
report that the two foods most associated with fatty liver.
You see that word associated? If he's referring to this article, that word associated means there is no mechanism. That's exactly what it means, right?
Which is a big risk factor for diabetes, are red meat and soft drinks.
This is so look at how even in the graphical abstract, which I think this is nonsense, first of all. They've phrased it in such a way that they're not saying what he's trying to say. They're not saying that red meat causes diabetes. They're saying that consumption of red meat seems to be correlated with an increased likelihood of NAFLD, of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, now called non-alcoholic steatosis or something. I forget the word. But there are foods there which mechanistically are known to cause fatty liver. Orange juice being one. Fructose is the main culprit, right? In fatty liver, right? You can go and look at many videos online about the role between fructose and fatty liver disease. So, and rice, if consumed in excess, glucose will get converted into fructose and will cause fatty liver disease, right? So, yeah, this is mostly nonsense. Yeah, even the vegans, like, why is fish and milk and dairy and eggs in the doesn't cause NAFLD thing? Like, if the vegans are saying that fat is the problem, why is saturated fat not there? This graphical abstract makes no sense at all. It only makes sense when you begin to understand that this is correlational data and doesn't prove anything at all.
Graphic from one of the papers shows that most foods are neutral for fatty liver disease. Nuts help prevent it, but red meat increases its likelihood.
So that's not what it said. Just to be clear, the way he's representing the paper is not what the paper said. The paper was all about associations and correlation. He made it sound like nuts decrease fatty liver. That's complete nonsense. They do not, right?
So could it be that glucose monitors caused us to intuit that meat doesn't cause diabetes, but actual data shows that silently it does?
No, we couldn't. That's not the case. You're talking complete nonsense, and you've cited no mechanism. You promised a mechanism. Where's the mechanism?
Whatever the reason, the data is clear that digital diabetes management companies are barely working, if at all. But can we conclude that
who cares?
The Salud and Plato's program is working? Here's the thing. Their diet is based on returning their patients to their traditional diets, practiced by millions of people in Asia, South.
Tofu is not traditional. Oat milk is not traditional. And if you want to get traditional diets, where are the protein sources? Where's the turkey? Where's the eggs? Where are the lizards? Where are the grubs? I want to see those things if we're talking about really decolonizing the diet.
America and Africa, who eat what they grow and have exceptionally low rates of diabetes. Think about Virta's solution. Someone immigrates from Mexico or China and gets diabetes from eating fast food their bodies have never been exposed to.
So people coming from Mexico have never been exposed to fast food. Chris, I think you need to enter the 21st century, my friend. Everyone's been exposed to fast food, okay?
Virta's solution is to expose them to yet another diet they've never been exposed to.
This is complete nonsense. There are culturally appropriate low-carb diets available. There are at least 5 videos on my channel, maybe more, about how to do low-carb if you're from an Indian background or Indian, Pakistani, South Asian background like myself. So this is a straw man. Like, no one is saying you have to eat whatever is there, right? With cheese and sausage, right? In fact, if you go to Virta's website, there are many different meal plans. There are many different ideas, including, I remember a Chinese one. It probably was a Mexican one too. So this is a real straw man. You're picking and choosing the arguments you want to fight against, and not having someone actually on screen representing this data. And I mean, you could get in touch with Steve Finney or someone like that who would actually be able to tell you how you're full of it.
People in rural Mexico and China, where diabetes rates are low, are not in ketosis and eating processed meat. They're eating what they grow, a diet that looks like Salud and Platos. What makes the results from Salud and Platos so remarkable?
I would challenge anyone to grow that kind of stuff. Like if you've actually been involved in subsistence farming, you know that it's a massive challenge. And nothing on that table was coming from subsistence farming, I can promise you. It was all coming from the grocery store. Remember, they said they're in Palo Alto. Yes, there are some people who do some farming and so on in Palo Alto. Yes, there are some rural areas nearby, but those things are like monocrops. Those things are industrial agriculture. Those things are the massive avocado plantations that, suck up water and are really not worth supporting, right? So yeah, again, it's a straw man. Like, if you want to really support sustainable agriculture, you have to answer the question of where the soil is going to come from. And there really only are 2 answers to that. One is the soil is going to come from animals, from their poop. And the second is the soil is going to come from fossil fuels, from derivatives of fossil fuels. So if you like supporting fossil fuels, then you can be vegan, I suppose. I don't recommend it because I don't think you should be eating those kind of chemicals. But if not, support regenerative, community-based, sustainable agriculture. And that means animal-based agriculture or agriculture that at least uses animals as part of its system.
is this population is apparently at much higher risk of diabetes than Blacks, Caucasians, and Asians, and yet they see such great numbers from going back to their traditional.
Just to be clear, we haven't seen great numbers here. We've seen pretty crappy results, all in all.
Diets. Some patients keep returning to track their progress. This 87-year-old has returned 6 times, and she remains off all the medications that she had been on for decades before.
That's cool, but you didn't tell us her numbers, right? If you're going to show someone on screen and you're going to show her as a success case, show us her numbers. Okay, that was MacAskill. Listen, responding to MacAskill is a bit of a burden. I tried to keep the swear words out of this one. It was not so easy because he's just so annoying. What do I find annoying about that guy? The biggest thing is that he actually knows better. As he mentioned, he's been in touch with people like Nick Norwitz who could actually represent these arguments for something like Virta a lot better than he can himself. He set up a straw man. He didn't do anything, and it wouldn't bother me so much if he didn't. If he was ignorant. If he was ignorant, it wouldn't bother me so much. But it bothers me because he's not ignorant. He knows better, and he's setting up this really bad system. Listen, diabetes is at base characterized by an excess of blood sugar in the blood, right? In that context, to be recommending a diet made exclusively of foods that break down into blood sugar, into glucose and fructose, is criminal, irresponsible, negligent. Pick one of those words, because maybe it's all three, right? If you suffer from diabetes, especially we're talking about type 2 diabetes here. We're not talking so much about type 1, although many of these lessons can be applicable to people with type 1 diabetes. But if you suffer from type 2 diabetes, the thing that you want to do is to lower your blood sugars. And the way to do that is to eat less sugar. And ultimately, if you can get it down as close as possible to zero, you're going to see better results, right? Now, are there other things going on? Are there heavy metal toxicities? There may be mold exposure? Is there sleep issues? Is there stress issues? Of course. All that stuff is real, and I don't want to say, and therefore, maybe you're having sodas like many of the people in this video were. Doing all that stuff is going to see improvement. There's no question about it. You can improve a long way, but ignoring the 2 macronutrients that are the most important, which are protein, dietary protein from animals, in my view, and fats from animals, and focusing on carbohydrates, in the end is going to be counterproductive for a lot of these people. And therefore, I think what these guys are doing is kind of irresponsible. And then comparing it with the Virta Health study in type 2 diabetics, when these people weren't all type 2 diabetics, I mean, it's not responsible, right? You're setting up a straw man. So with that, thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.